In another video, I mentioned I haven't encountered any boring main characters, but over the past few months or so, reflecting on it more, I realized I have encountered boring main characters, two actually, from the same game, Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn, the sequel to Fire Emblem Path of Radiance. If you're not familiar with the Fire Emblem games, you might know these as the games that Ike is from. So when Radiant Dawn was being marketed, Micaiah, a new character, and Soth, a character from the first game, were presented as main characters. Expectations were high, and those expectations were demolished in, not in a good way. The way they weren't smashed in a cool way with, a cool sledgehammer or a holy sword. They just sort of, fizzed out. Micaiah and Soth have so many writing problems that I'm going to focus this first video on Soth because he's just straight up boring, whereas Micaiah is a Mary Sue, something that clearly needs its own video. So, when Soth was first presented as a main character, I was really excited. In Path of Radiance, he is a thief who has stowed away on the ship that Ike is on, and you can choose to make him a unit of your party. In Path of Radiance, Soth is independent, he's capable, self-sufficient, he's biased against nobility because of his street urchin background, and he's only seen the worst of nobles. And I quote, "Most nobles get rich by trampling on the commoners, then spend their lives basking in filthy luxury. I've known them to be that way since the day I was born. They've never seen a blister or sweat for a day's meal in their lives." Soth could only form friendships with two characters, Astrid, a young noble lady, and Tormod, a child raised by the shape-shifting Lagos. And by the way, humans are called Barok in these games, and that's what I'll be calling them in this video. That's just the level of nerdiness we're at. We're using a fancy name for humans. I'm sorry. Anyway, Soth's chats with Astrid are good, because at first he doesn't like her. She's just another noble. But after getting to know her, he apologizes for making assumptions about her, and he accepts her. Their chats not only show his disdain for nobility, but also show that he's willing to change his perspective and admit he was wrong, which are good character traits. His initial chats with Tormod are really brief, which, I can't blame him. Tormod comes up and he's like, "We're gonna be friends now." And Soth is like, "What? No, why?" But finally Tormod shares that his Lagos father figure thinks that it's his own fault that Tormod doesn't have any Barok friends, and it's something that his father figure worries about. So that's why Tormod wanted to be Soth's friend, to make his father figure Muaram feel better. A lot of children would find this very weird, but Soth was like, "Nah, I get it." And they begin a funny little friendship. So Soth is a bit of a weirdo, but in a good way. Also, these conversations show that Soth doesn't seem to have any sort of issues with the Lagos. The fact that Muaram is a Lagos doesn't stop Soth from relating to the situation. And in a world where racial tensions are often really high and really intense, this is a good trait. One might say it's a very good trait, especially for a main character. So in Path of Radiance, we don't really see much else from Soth, but there is some growth. When you invade the Dayan capital, Soth has a moment where he's very open with Ike and he shares what's on his mind without much prompting. They didn't have support conversations, but ever since joining Ike's mercenary group, Soth has clearly grown to trust and respect Ike. He also stays with Ike's army even after trying and failing to find Micaiah and Dayan, which is interesting. Does he believe in the cause of the Crimean army? Or is he just wanting to support the people he's been working with? We don't know for sure. It's never really indicated. This is something that could be explored in the sequel, perhaps. So yeah. So Soth has some fine traits. He's reserved but earnest, he's honest and willing to admit fault, he's not prejudiced against the Lagos, despite growing up in Dayan, which is quite a feat, and he's also very flexible. Once he's changed his mind about someone or something, he commits to it. There's no wishy-washy hesitation, this sort of flexibility and being very determined. This could be some good character traits to explore. You could see the good sides of this and the bad sides of this. So, good material to start with. They could delve deeper into this kid and see what makes him tick. But what actually happened? What did we see of older Soth in Radiant Dawn now that he has become a main character? First we see Soth admires Ike and understands the invasion of Dayan from Crimea and Ike's perspectives. Both of these things are, to be expected given his experience in the last game, and this does lead to some interesting chats between Soth and Micaiah, as well as Soth providing an alternative perspective for the Dawn Brigade as a whole. By the way, the Dawn Brigade is the incredibly dorky name for the tiny band of freedom fighters that Soth and Micaiah are in when the game starts. Anyways, second, we also see that Soth is protective of Micaiah, which makes sense. They're like family. And while he supports the Dawn Brigade and later the Dayan army as a whole, he is clearly committed to people who are involved, not the cause. And he's also completely willing to abandon the cause and flee with Micaiah if things get too hairy. He says this multiple times, like, okay, we'll stay and help the Dayan army, but if things get too bad, we're leaving. We'll just go leave everybody else. They wouldn't even leave behind the Dawn Brigade. Like, I guess they don't really have that much of a bond with the other members of the Dawn Brigade, even though, like, there's one of them says, like, yeah, we're like family. It's like, I don't think Soth and Micaiah feel that way, because, like, Micaiah doesn't protest. Soth doesn't seem bothered by the fact that they just be ditching the Dawn Brigade, who they're supposed to be, like, at least somewhat close to. Like, all he cares about is Micaiah. Like, honestly, if anything, it feels like Soth is more of a loner in this game than the previous game, which is, like, caring about one person instead of, like, the people in general and a whole army, plus a couple friends. Like, that feels like the opposite of character growth. It's regression. This is very bad, especially for main character, especially when it feels unintentional and doesn't lead to anything or go anywhere. It's not explored. So, while Soth talks and behave more maturely in the new game, at the core, we don't see anything new from him. Like, did he ever get over his general bias against the nobles? Like, having one noble friend doesn't mean your general prejudice has been addressed. Like, he could be saying really nasty things about the nobles and be like, oh, it's okay. I could say this. I have a friend who's a noble. Like, he never does that. It would be pretty hilarious if he did. But anyways, here's the thing, though. The worlds of the Fire Emblem games are incredibly cruel. Both commoners and nobility can be called to or forced to make great sacrifices and suffer enormous losses because these worlds are not easy on anybody. Like, it'd be great for Soth to fully face that he can't assume what people are going through based on their social status. Even if, like, the majority of nobles are the way that he thinks that they are, it doesn't change the fact that that the player also knows a lot of the noble characters have gone through terrible things, with Alencia being the most obvious example in the world. Okay, Soth had a good start with Astrid in the first game, but he treated her like an exception. He didn't open his mind about other experiences of other people who are of noble birth. Hey, so you know what would have been good to help him do this? Like, a noble character in his party, perhaps. Too bad there weren't any. Oh, wait, no, there were two. There were Leonardo, who was in the Dawn Brigade, and Toruno. So Leonardo was a rich kid who lost everything when Ike's army stormed through Dayan, and, Soth helped Ike do that, by the way. And Toruno was a Dayan general who had an incredibly sad and miserable home life because of the weight of the expectations of his old noble military family. It was very sad, and maybe Soth could have chatted with these guys at some point and expanded his mind a bit, and he didn't. We didn't see any of that. Also, how did Soth not get indoctrinated to hate Laguz? Dayan is like racist country, okay? Like, they hate Laguz. It took another character who grew up in Dayan a very long time in the first game to get over the indoctrination she grew up with. How was he not biased against the Laguz? If he ever had any bias, when and how did he get over it? Was it Ike's influence? Something else? Or, if he dodged the bullet and was never prejudiced against them to begin with, how on earth did that happen? Did Micaiah make an effort to educate him about Laguz so he wouldn't grow up hating them? That would have been really interesting if she did, and would have made me really like her. But we don't know. In the end, Soth's character in this game has two modes. 1, protect Micaiah, and 2, fanboy over Ike. The second one is way more fun, but it barely happens. He's not interesting, he's not thought-provoking, he's not even fun to watch 99% of the time. He's just boring. Aside from letting him have more personality by, doing interesting and fun things by being a fanboy, the biggest thing to make this boring character interesting is character growth. He starts out focused on Micaiah, protective of her, willing to work for good causes, but ultimately he's more about the people than the cause. Okay, not a bad thing, but obviously has its setbacks. Why can't he commit himself to a bigger cause? This could be an interesting thing to explore. Maybe it's connected to a fear of abandonment and loss. I mean, he grew up alone in the streets until he met Micaiah, and she left him behind and somewhere around the beginning of Fire Emblem 9, Path of Radiance, like, you ran into him while he was traveling all over a warring continent trying to find her. Like, that's pretty intense for a kid, even if he's a street urchin. Also, in the first game, he supported only 2 people. He tried hard to avoid interacting with Tormod at all. He excuses his behavior by being like, oh, I'm a thief, so I'm a loner. But, like, you could explore that further. It's kind of a weak excuse. Like, maybe connecting with other people makes abandonment by them, losing them, possible. Obviously, yeah, he can survive on his own. He can meet his own physical needs, but what about his emotional needs and his needs for connection and community? So this game could easily set up early on that he has a fear of loss and reinforce where it comes from, why it's so strong, etc. And by confronting this fear, he can confront what his beliefs are, where his loyalties lie, what matters to him most, and like what his principles are. He can still be motivated by people. Again, this isn't a bad trait, but he needs to recognize it and understand it and own it. And he needs to, like, think about how far he'll go to support a person rather than a cause. And yeah, and this all needs to be done in a mature way. And by that I mean, it's more than him being like, Micaiah is the only one that matters, everyone else can die, LOL, sorry suckers. Like, that's a bit of a simplification, but like, honestly, we just don't get that much more from him. So how might Soth face his fears and his different misbeliefs and grow? I mean, obviously through events in the game, but also support conversations. Radiant Dawn did not have proper support conversations, and that was the stupidest mistake they ever made. Supports provide so many good chances for character growth, which includes for Soth. You know, he could be growing, and we could see him being not boring through fun and interesting character exchanges. For example, Micaiah and Soth conversations. So their bond is very strong, so what they're each going through emotionally would naturally come up when they chat. If Micaiah sees him avoiding making new relationships or deepening his current friendships, like, that could be talked about. It could also lead to a discussion of Micaiah's own introvert tendencies and how maybe introversion is different from avoiding meaningful relationships. And they could also confront how he's prioritizing her over everything else and how she's focused on bigger goals than he is. And yeah, just confront these differences between them and use that to develop their characters. Also, let's see Soth and Tormod have more chats. We really didn't see much of their friendship in Fire Emblem 9. Like, their supports were really short. And we only saw, like, a little bit of it in Radiant Dawn as is. So, like, let's see them bonding and becoming besties. They have such different personalities. It could be a lot of fun. Also, any bias that Soth might have against the Laguz would obviously come up since Tormod's adoptive father is a Laguz, and also he grew up with them. So yeah, also, like, if Micaiah did raise Soth to not be prejudiced, that could also come up here too. Like, that would be great to learn more about. We could also have Soth talk with Leonardo or another noble. Yeah, let's see Soth's bias in regards to the nobles be addressed and grow, let's see it become more than I have one noble friend. Yeah. Oh, also, I'd love to see him talk with a older character like Torino or Nolan. Like, Soth sees himself as kind of outside of the army he's in. So, like, let's have him confront this in a support conversation with an older character who he would interact with regularly. So yeah, someone in the Daean army for sure. Also, can we please have Soth have a support with a Laguz? In Radiant Dawn, Soth is a main character in a game that is largely about the racial tension between the Barok and the Laguz. It is so weird that he never talks with the Laguz. Like, maybe he could speak with Vika, who he runs into early on, or I don't know, just someone. So, using Soth as an example, I think a boring character can be summed up as needs more. Just needs more character. And there's a lot of potential here, so I can't bring myself to dislike Soth. It's the writers I blame, or really just whatever crazy person thought it was a good idea to not have proper support conversations. Like, that was such a cursed choice. It feels like evil executive meddling was going on. Oh, also, I forgot there's hints of this, like, fun little rivalry between Soth and the Black Knight. It's basically really one-sided, which is actually pretty hilarious. I would have enjoyed seeing more of that, seeing Soth just, like, having this, like, one-sided bitterness and dislike towards the Black Knight, who just, like, completely ignores him. Yeah, that would be great. Have you ever run into a boring character like Soth? Have you ever played Radiant Dawn? What were your thoughts on it? Do you think I'm totally off the mark with Soth, that maybe I'm just totally missing things? Comment down below and let me know your thoughts, and I'll get Micaiah's video out pretty soon, probably in about a week. And yeah, I'll see y'all in another video. Bye bye!